Hello and welcome to our first debrief episode of season 11 of the Fueling Creativity in Education podcast. And because we're on YouTube for the first time, or shall I say we're making a commitment to produce a whole bunch of episodes on YouTube throughout the season, we want to just give you a quick summary of the debrief. So Cyndi and I engage in a debrief to talk about our past 3 guests that have been on the show. We have 12 episodes in a single season. That means we produce 4 debriefs, and today's the first one, as I said, of season 11. So Cyndi, why don't you tell us who we are debriefing today?
Yes, so first we had Dr. Henry Smith, who is a professor at Johns Hopkins University and is the former Assistant Secretary of Education for the Clinton administration, who talked about policy. And then second, we had Emily Jamison, who was an elementary school teacher of Matt's son, Liam. And she came on the show to talk about bringing creativity into her classroom and building a culture of family in your classroom. And finally, we had creativity researcher Dr. Keith Sawyer, who talked about his latest book. And you just read it. So what was it called, Matt?
In fact, I still have it on my desk. It's called Learning to See Inside the World's Leading Art and Design Schools. That was a great conversation.
Great. So we're going to be talking about these 3 episodes and our 3 big insights based off those episodes. So Matt, do you want to get us started? Who would you like to talk about first?
So we should do it in order. So let's talk a little bit about Henry. And we've touched on education policy before, but I think this was the first time we had someone who has experience, particularly working in government at the national level. And, you know, it was the conversation around school vouchers. You know, you and I have had some Marco Polos about school vouchers, and obviously with the current administration, it's come up again recently. And it's the conversation ultimately centered on the system and the lack of creativity in the system of schooling. And when we started to talk a little bit about finding alternative models, this idea that school vouchers could provide an opportunity to fund or at least support alternative models, and therefore gaining greater attention on those alternative models, so that if they are successful, possibly there's opportunities for that success to be replicated within the larger public school system. I found that really fascinating, and I found myself in a situation where I was saying, okay, if we're looking at the system lacking creativity, then I probably need to be a little bit more open to some of the suggestions on how to improve the system, including things like school vouchers. Because, there might be people listening right now that's like, school vouchers are bad. I mean, there's a lot of concerns from an equity perspective around school vouchers. But ultimately, I suppose my takeaway is for me to be a little bit more open in terms of how I'm reviewing the system and, avenues to which creativity may unexpectedly come from.
Yeah, it's interesting about the school vouchers, Matt, because I've also had sort of mixed feelings that if students get vouchers, then they can go to private schools or pay for other schools. And there will still be money that is required for those schools. So only those students that are, say, middle class would be able to attend those schools, leaving the students that are low income behind back in public schools. So I see the concerns around the vouchers. And at the same time, we have an upcoming interview that we'll be sharing with someone who is in the micro school movement, who talked about the power of vouchers to create your own micro school. And so I think that was also a little mind shifting for me. And I'll just heighten the anticipation there, Matt, for our listeners, to say that this episode was really enlightening in terms of the possibilities for the future. Because ultimately, what I found fascinating, and I was a little nervous going into this interview with Dr. Henry Smith, and he was so lovely, but I was nervous about what he was going to say. Like, creativity doesn't belong, but he was all for creativity, one. And second off, he said, not only is the school system not working, but we need to tear down the house. And that's the phrase he used, tear down the house. And I remember thinking, wow, he's really for that revolutionary approach, because that we've had many times conversations on the podcast about, do we need an evolutionary approach and small changes, or a revolutionary approach? He was all for a revolution in education, to just totally tear down the house and rebuild from the beginning. And so I think the vouchers could be one way to sort of test that idea. But I thought that was really interesting and scary. And I remember him saying, and I wrote it down actually, he said, I remember talking to someone that was a faculty member in the Department of Ed at Johns Hopkins. And they said, well, if we knew what the secret sauce is, we would all be out of a job. And there's something powerful in that, is that we're all trying to figure it out. And this is a question that comes up in conversations over and over when we're at educational conferences and we're working with schools. What is it that we truly need to do to catch up with the current state of the world? So I think the vouchers piece could be a really interesting avenue to test things out.
What was your second takeaway of our first 3 episodes?
All right, so let's talk a little bit about Emily Jamison. And I think one of the things that I loved, it was a really simple strategy she used that I would like to just reiterate in case you didn't listen to that episode. But one simple strategy she used was making time for feedback in her classroom, and specific growth oriented feedback, where she would have a student come up and she would say to the student, pick the color of the pen that you would like to use for me to write your feedback. And so giving students that choice and agency to select the color, and then going through and explaining the work and how they could strengthen the work they were doing. And I remember she did something that was a visual cue to the rest of the classmates that it was her time with that particular student and they should let her work with that student and not interrupt. And I just thought that was a really powerful way to sort of set boundaries and allow the students a little agency. And it reminded me of something that really bothered me when my children were in 3rd grade. They had a teacher who, she had them journaling all the time. And then she would go with a red pen and just write all this feedback in red pen. And there was something like viscerally wrong with that to me. Cause I'm like, they're in 3rd grade. They're writing in a journal. This isn't like a research paper. I wouldn't do that to my graduate students, but I do like the idea of feedback. So giving them that choice of like, I want my feedback in purple sparkles, and writing your feedback in that. And you look at that and it makes you happy instead of making you feel that yuck reaction to that red pen that means everything you're doing is, or some of the things that you're doing is wrong. So that was my big takeaway with Emily's. And of course, her talking about the family and how the best environments feel like family, but is that creative? And I think it is. But does it need to be at that level in order to be highly creative? What do you think?
Oh, you gave a lot there. I mean, the first thing was she put something on the head. I forgot what it's called, the headband. And
Yep.
funny story. Liam, as you referenced, was her student last year. We had a wonderful time with Mrs. Jameson, and he loves elephants. So over the summer, after she told us that story, because we recorded it before we went away, I actually found some elephant type bands, and I gave it to her last week, just so she's got another kind of headset that she can wear.
Mm.
And I think those visual cues in the classroom are great. And I would say creative, right? As we're kind
Yes.
of like creating our routines, I think that's an example of that everyday creativity. How do I come up with an outcome that helps students recognize that this is my time with somebody else other than them? And
Mm.
there's probably lots of ways we could do it. And the way Mrs. Jameson chose to do that, I think, was a creative outcome. And I think it's the example of us being creative in our practice. So yes, I do think it is, as we're working toward building that culture of family and the instructional methods and decisions that we make, or the protocols that we put in place to do that. Just before I kind of share my takeaway, it was funny, when you was talking about that red pen piece, and you alluded to it, but I want to kind of throw it back and challenge you to expand a little bit more. We have on this episode encouraged us to think exactly as you just referenced, that feedback we used, I think, in one of the episodes is in essence a note to go forward with. And so
Right.
if we've successfully created a culture where feedback is just seen as a note to be better, and perhaps we even value feedback, then it wouldn't necessarily matter what color the pen is, right? So are we getting them to choose the color of the pen because in essence we're still acknowledging this discomfort with feedback, and therefore potentially a shortfall in our efforts to make feedback, normalize feedback as part of the learning process? What's your thought on that? Is it what's the word? Are we in essence putting a Band-Aid over the problem or not?
think it's putting a Band-Aid on it. I think it's actually making it a little bit more playful. So if I'm looking at something in purple sparkles that you've given me feedback on, I'm going to take to that a little bit more than I would take to red pen feedback. And maybe that's my own bias against red pen. I remember having like a writing teacher in college who just marked everything with red pen. And it was like the more red pen you saw, the more worried you got that, you don't know how to write, sort of thing. But I think just normalizing it and giving students a way to accept in a way that's pleasurable to them is a positive thing for the classroom. I don't think it's putting a Band-Aid on it.
No, okay. I could keep going on that, but I mean, ultimately giving them a choice, right? I
Right.
think there's certainly a plus that a situation that might be perceived as creating discomfort by
Mhm.
going and having some choice. You might even get to a point where a young child is like, "Oh, more sparkles on the paper," potentially, right?
Right.
I
Right.
see that, but I'm still going to go away and think a little bit more, because ultimately, potentially, are we in a time, because of how many things that teachers have, that actually the more red pen you see on the paper, it actually might actually suggest the more commitment and dedication you've had to that paper. And as I said, the more feedback you've got to make it better and changing that mindset. But it also could be something that we have to think about differently via the grades as well.
Right. And I think it's also contextual, right, Matt?
Mm-hmm.
It's like if I'm looking at a third grade journal where you're just trying to get students' ideas out, that might not
Mm-hmm.
be the place to use a pen,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you just want them writing. You want them in the practice of sharing their ideas. But as they get into middle school and especially in high school, maybe you do take a firm hand to like your purple glittery marker and giving them a lot of feedback because they've learned how to generate ideas to articulate their thoughts. So I think it is contextual as well. Like, I don't think there's a reason why you need to give a young child in elementary school a lot of that feedback on things that are just like, tell us about something you did this weekend, or tell us about your best friend, or what's something you love to do in the summertime. Like those sorts of things it's really about just getting students to generate ideas. It's almost like diverging and converging at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, you're right, and potentially delaying judgment in some places, and
Yeah.
it's all part of that. The whole conversation was also that sit down, that one-on-one time with the teacher, with the student.
Yeah.
So if you've got that one-on-one time, then obviously there's certainly less need to kind of communicate everything on the paper. All right, so my one, Mrs. Jameson, was very simple, and you know what? It could just be an oversight on my part,
Mhm.
but I was really taken with the strategy of getting students to write about their summer and write about themselves, because obviously there's a lot of passion towards writing, but being able to express yourself on the page and deliberately facilitate ongoing questions, but with the strategy of, oh, it's not about, yeah, I'm testing their writing, I'm getting them to do some free writing, etc., but it's also a tool, a strategy for me to better know my students as they're coming in the year. And it seems like
Mm.
an obvious idea, and I kind of worry that
Mhm.
everyone's like, yeah, we've been doing that for years and months. But I was in the grade 1 classroom, and I never did that. It never occurred to me to do that, and I just really like that idea. And I think that
Mm.
speaks to Mrs. Jameson. I'm biased. I've experienced Mrs. Jameson, but that the whole, she really knows her students throughout the year, and I think starting off with that activity shows a commitment that I'm going to provide a learning experience, but I'm also going to go get to know my students from the very beginning and do my best to kind of make various connections to them, their personal interests and their personal backgrounds along the way. I love that. So less of a takeaway and more of just an acknowledgement of a teacher that obviously I really admired and grateful for based on last year.
And the importance of starting off the school year, not only with this mindset of I'm interested in knowing you, but getting students to write their ideas and share their ideas and making writing a normalized thing, right? Especially I think at the elementary school. It goes back to the story that I just shared about the third grade teacher. It's like you just want to get them
Mm-hmm.
writing and thinking and sharing. And the more they feel safe in doing that, then you come in with the layers of, hey, why don't you try this? Why did you do this way? You missed a period here. Let's make, all of those things, they sort of scaffold in because they feel safe in sharing ideas with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Really love it.
Hmm.
Great episode. Great 2 episodes. So third
Yeah.
one, our third
Oh, why
one,
don't you
Keith,
start
Keith
with
Sawyer.
Keith? Why don't you start with Keith Sawyer?
Well, first of all, I enjoyed Keith's book, and the obvious connection for me is that Keith is conducting research in a space that I'm very familiar with. So I teach in the University of Connecticut School of Fine Arts. So I'm regularly interacting with artists and designers, and I struggle to define me and my place in that. I probably, my instructional design background, design thinking background, it allows me to relate a lot with design. But some of the things that we sometimes see as art and the art process, perhaps I identify with less, though still highly respected. But I interacted with a lot of colleagues and, in that space. And it's always been fascinating to me around that creativity piece because of the stereotype around creativity in the arts. I know myself, I've recognized that if someone says, well, what's your background? I don't typically say creativity when I'm in that type of environment because I think it sets up a lot of misunderstandings and everyone ultimately sees themselves as being in the field of creativity and arguably they could say that they are. So sometimes we find ourselves then saying the science of creativity, and I think even that creates some challenges. So I think ultimately I was really excited to have our interview with Keith. And ultimately, I got even more excited when it was centered around the book that evolved to being learning to see. So instead of learning to be creative, it was learning to see. And seeing is so important in design, and it's so important in art. But also what's wonderful about seeing is the different perspectives to which we can see and learn to see. So just that general concept, I really, really enjoyed. And I could go on, but if you want to provide me with a specific point, the studio talk piece, I think the learning to see, Keith referenced something in the book called Studio Talk and spoke a little bit about that episode. And I think we need to make sure we have sufficient time that typically art studios provide where you talk about what you're seeing and you talk about what you saw emerged. And you get to reflect on the different seeing that's occurring in that environment. But the challenge for me is, how do you take that studio talk, which is where you're talking about what you see and what you saw, into other domains or other subjects rather, when perhaps the time is squeezed? So that was really my takeaway. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts of that, because I know when we speak to educators, there is a feeling that time is squeezed. And I think the level of talking that's needed to find all of the seeing that can exist in a creative experience, it could be an entire lesson, could be 2 lessons. So how much time do we actually dedicate in this very packed curriculum to just having conversations about what are you seeing?
I love that, Matt. And I have so many questions. So let's start here. When people ask you that are in the arts and design, what's your background? What do you say if you don't say creativity?
I think I say creativity in education and trying to
Okay.
facilitate and cultivate creative thinking. I sometimes by default might use the word design thinking, but I know that doesn't do my background justice, so I don't like using
Right.
it.
Right.
But you can see even in that response there, Cyndi, I'm struggling, and it's interesting. It's that struggle has primarily come about because of my experience working in the department, and it could be myself doing. It might not necessarily be from anyone else, but it's definitely a question I struggle to answer.
Well, it's interesting, Matt, because I think I say that a lot. I'm noticing that it's really interesting. Our podcast is really interesting. I have had so many conversations with artists about creativity. And like one of my passions is bridging the language between the arts and sciences of creativity. And I have always found that going to artists of any capacity and saying, I'm going to talk about deliberate creativity. And sometimes that's a phrase I use, deliberate creativity.
It's a good
They
phrase.
just, they cross their arms and give me the eyebrow furrow and don't really want to listen. I would say they're typically not open to that idea. I actually had one woman who just got up and walked away and said, I'm not listening to what you have to say. So I laugh because,
I've experienced that
obviously,
as well. Yeah.
the, you know, I laugh because it's mildly comical because, one of the first principles we teach is keeping open, right? So it's like, wait, come back, just keep open just for a moment. And, trying to have that conversation. And I know we tried to ask Keith about what designers say, and he said they just don't say what I'm doing is creative, but they consider themselves creatives. So, and I remember that conversation we had with Dorte Nielsen from Denmark, and we asked her, like,
Hmm.
how do you do this? And she said it's never been an issue. So we see this range of feelings around the word creatives with people like designers and artists. And it is confusing in terms of the language and how we approach it and what we do. But going back to what you said around what you see, it reminds me of my son, who this year has taken an AP art class. And he decided sort of late in the game in the summer that he was going to take this AP art class. And he wanted to focus on photography. So it was just a few days before school started. And he said, Mom, I need you to drive me around because I need to take photographs around a single word. So the word he chose was night. And so we had to go find 15, he had to go take 15 different pictures of night. And I go to sleep at 9 o'clock. And so that was challenging because it had to be between 8 and 9 o'clock that we were driving around trying to find pictures of night. And it was all different. He had all these different ideas of how he perceived night and how he would capture that in an interesting way. And then he had to showcase this on the first day of school. And I left and I said to my husband, who also loves photography, I said, we should think about doing a challenge like this, like once a month as a family, like that we pick a phrase. And not kidding you, this guy walks past us with an Oreo t-shirt that day because we were walking around Canada. This guy walks around with an Oreo t-shirt that says, stay playful. And he said, that should be our theme for this month, stay playful. And so all of a sudden you think, okay, let's see what kind of images we can capture around this theme, stay playful. What does it look like? What does it look like to you? What does it look like to me? What does it look like to, now let's expand this into the classroom. We get everyone in the classroom to focus on what does stay playful look like. And let's bring those images together and let's have a conversation around that. So going back to like, how can we bring this into the classroom? I think that's a very simple way is you're teaching maybe a vocabulary word or a content piece. How was this particular thing that happened in history? How is it impacting your world now? Let's think about that and take a photograph of that. And our goal this week is to find a photograph that represents how this incident impacted this, whatever it is you take a photograph of. Or we had Joe Bowler on the podcast talking about math and concepts of math. How can you capture concepts of math through images? There's so many different ways you can bring it in. But what I think is really interesting is now, ever since that day we went out looking for images, everywhere I go when it's nighttime, I'm looking for an interesting image to capture on my phone because I'm like, this is really fun. It's really fun to take photographs and it's fun to be like on the lookout for something. And I think it's one way that we can both heighten anticipation and extend the learning around a particular content area.
And you were using the word a lot, like what does this look like, and then having conversations about, well, this is what I saw, and I think that still speaks to this idea of what do you see. But then also, when you actually told me that story a couple of weeks ago, I was going to play with you and said it was curious that because you had said you had to get up between 5 and 8, and I think a really fun question could have been, well, how do you see night during the day? And it might have been fascinating that it didn't have to be at nighttime. The concept of night probably is expressed in different ways during the time. And from that conversation I had with you, I was thinking about, well, how do I differentiate night leaving? And I started to say to myself, well, there's typically dew. There's typically that calm, like night has just left, birds chirping, things like that can represent night in some ways as well. But the key point is, we do need that opportunity to have a conversation about it. Why did you select that image? What do you see here in this historical artifact? Or what do you see happening or occurring in this historical event that we're talking about? And then what do you see? What similarities do you see between this event and, today's events? And imagine that you are this or you have this background. How might you see things differently? And I think that ultimately is what you're talking about and building upon. I love that idea. So again, it's finding the time to pose those questions. What do we see and what do we hear other people seeing? Yeah, love it.
All right, Matt. Well, I think that was a great kickoff to season 11. And before we go, we did mention in our launch episode that we were going to share something about a dance that you were going to learn by the end of the season. Did you find out what the dance was called?
Oh, yes. Thanks for bringing that up, Cyndi. It was called the shuffle. Have you heard the shuffle?
No.
You don't know the shuffle? So
No. You gonna show it to me?
That's the dance move. It's like,
Okay.
and you know what? My knee's feeling okay at the moment. So
Okay.
yeah, if you missed our opening, I was talking a little to Cyndi, who had shared a story about dance, that I wanted to try and do a dance move by the end of the year. And Cyndi didn't know what dance move I was talking about. And it's called the shuffle. So you're going to have to go on social media. But it's like the Running Man. But Cyndi, I really enjoyed the first 3 episodes. Some challenges with the fact that it's video, some additional hurdles that we had to cross. But looking forward to our next 3 guests and our next debrief together. And of course, we are getting a little bit nearer to the National Association of Gifted and Talented Conference, where we will be presenting as well. And anyone who is listening and have not signed to our Extra Fuel newsletter, we encourage you to go to our website, fuelingcreativitypodcast.com, and you can subscribe there, as well as catch up with past episodes and also check out our collections page. My name is Dr. Matthew Worwood.
And my name is Dr. Cyndi Burnett. This episode was produced by Cyndi Burnett and Matthew Worwood. Our podcast assistant is Ann Fernando, and our editor is Sheikh Ahmed.